ABC BookWorld is probably something, if you said it just now, no people wouldn't know what it is. But around 1990s or so, I was very aware how much BC writers were invisibilized on the planet, which I could talk great length about, but I'll stop right there. And so I thought, well, what are we going to do? So I did a book called 1001 BC Authors prior to the internet. And then when the internet comes along, you go, hold on a second. Why don't let's record all BC authors, or at least have some record of them, because nobody's done it. And it's like, why? What are the universities been doing? Anyway, they're studying people from elsewhere, never BC. So I started to try and make a search engine on the internet, which was exclusively about books by BC authors. And from there, I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And I think when I finally stopped doing BookWorld, there's over 12,000 BC authors. Each one had an entry, and you could look it up. And so that was a kind of a private sidelong initiative I did in conjunction with the BC BookWorld, because I was always aware that for every book I wrote about, I'm not writing about 20 others. And I don't like the idea that somebody is being invisibilized. So my goal was to put all the information I could into one place where people could find out about all BC books and all BC authors. Of course, with the way the hierarchy works in high school, in English 12, they had all the great writers on the wall, and I looked up and they were all English and dead. And then you realize the next tier down is American and dead, and then British and alive, and English or American alive, and maybe you might have Ontario with a couple people, but BC doesn't even exist in the hierarchy. And so all the information that comes at us from all media over the Rocky Mountains where we live telling us what is important, it was a good idea to start sending some volleys back and say, hold on, we're here and we're important. And you can't expect Moscow to care about Vladivostok, so it's up to the Vladivostokians to care about themselves. So as a cultural warfare exercise, one wants to establish BC BookWorld and also ABC BookWorld, and make sure that BC writers are not invisibilized. And so that's basically was my mandate. Well, books would come in every day, and you just do the best you can. And sometimes I'd write a lot about something, and sometimes those entries are like 10,000 words, and sometimes they could be 2 sentences. So still, is that you just do the best you can. And I never was paid for that or anything like that. It was just something, I wouldn't say it was a mania, or it was more of a mission, I guess, in that maybe fueled by some degree of anger. I was a stringer for Quill and Quire for a while. I used to keep all the copies of books in Canada in Quill and Quire in my basement, just to see what percentage of those had a BC writer on the cover. And of course, it was basically close to nil. And so I realized nobody else is going to help you until you help yourself. So I just decided to do it. It wasn't anything that I expected rewards for or anything like that. It was just something like, well, this is meant to be done. Somebody's got to do it. And so most of the stuff I do hasn't been done just because, oh God, nobody's done it. ABC BookWorld thing went in sync with the BC BookWorld, but we also started up the BC Book Prizes, and then I've been involved in starting prizes as well. So, you know, as John Fowles wrote in a novel called Daniel Martin, in page 187 somewhere, I underlined it, to draw attention to anything is to glorify it. And it's a very interesting, deep operating principle for life. And you can see why Goebbels, Hitler's communications director, understood that very well. So to draw attention to anything is to glorify it. Doesn't matter whether the information is negative or positive. I mean, look at it, Trumpism is an example of this as well. So what do we choose to draw our attention to in British Columbia if you want to believe that possibly we have our own unique society, and then from that, if oneself is unique, it works kind of backwards the other way. So to glorify BC writers and BC publishers, because they're a really important component as well, is to glorify them and to create change. Yeah, we have a wealth of great writers that haven't been recognized because we're at the end of Western civilization and there's a hierarchy and that I mentioned, etc. So it's really important to have somebody write down who's been forgotten. W.K. Lamb was a big hero of Basil Stewart Stubbs, who was a very progressive librarian at UBC and was involved in starting up UBC Press, among other things. In fact, the Publishers Association of Western Canada was started by Basil Stewart Stubbs, and now no one knows who he is. So we don't have much cultural memory, and I believe in British Columbia right now, I think we're less of an interesting, unique society than we used to be, and people can argue against that, but that's my view of it. And so I, in some ways, I don't know what's going to happen now, but I had to free up space for myself at the end of my life to do some projects of my own, and so I'm happy to have done what I did, but I'm glad everything I seem to have started is still in existence, which makes me feel good, because there's no point starting something and then disappears, right? So I think we've gone through a golden era for BC writing and publishing. I think it's retrograde now. One of the people who I think affected me was George Woodcock, self-declared anarchist, but someone who wrote 120 books. And I guess because George Ingeborg didn't have a son, maybe I was kind of adopted in some kind of psychological way. I'm not sure, but I knew them both and they were influential to me in some way. But George was someone who liked to say he was a British Columbian first and a Canadian second. And that's entirely how I've felt about my life before I met George Woodcock. So it's maybe the isolationism of British Columbia, but I don't think it matters. Both my family backgrounds are fifth generation, my mom and dad, fifth generation British Columbians or something. So, but like, it doesn't matter whether you've been here 5 generations or many more generations, or even you just arrive. You know, you live here, you're part of this place. What are we going to do with it? Everybody's equal and nobody's better. And so it's kind of been interesting to remain on this edge of the western edge of the planet and figure out what we're supposed to be making of ourselves, because we have the freedom to be new and different. So that's an incredible luxury. And I also had the luxury I didn't have to go to war. So what am I supposed to do with this life in this really interesting place? A wonderful man named Hubert Evans, before he wrote Mist in the River in 1954, really the most important BC novel in terms of he and his wife lived in the Kispioks and with First Nations people, and all the major characters in Mist in the River are First Nations individuals, completely believable. And that's just an incredible book. But he came to the West Coast because he was in the First World War, and he was in the trenches, and he was a newspaper man who, but they wanted to get away from the chaos of that old world madness of the First World War, mustard gas and things like that. And so he came here and wrote a book called The New Front Line. Not the old front line of Europe where he was in the front lines, but the new front line of British Columbia, which is where idealism has room to grow, and where you have to make your own new models. And so British Columbia, being at the end of that Western migration of European civilization, is in many ways still a new place. Yes, I'm aware of First Nations. I've been to Jim Hart's house. I understand the importance of cultural diversity, and I've supported. did the first book on Indigenous BC writers, the only book on Indigenous writers from a particular province that still exists. There isn't never been done anywhere else. So I understand that we are a composite, but I also understand the opportunity that we have of British Columbia of not being mired in the old ways of thinking, which gives us the incredible luxury of possibly being able to invent things that are new and better and different. And lo and behold, this is the place that gave the world Greenpeace, for God's sake, and we're trying to save the planet. So we're a very interesting place. Are we living up to our potential for what we can make of British Columbia? I'd say no. We have this incredible film industry, which is a branch of LA. What movie has all these gifted people in British Columbia made for and about this place after these billions of dollars go flowing back and forth with the expertise we have in the film industry? Tell me what movie all those people have made about this place that matters. Nothing. Maybe The Gray Fox, but that was like 40 years ago. So come on, folks. So I see British Columbia as having an incredible potential, and you can see it actually realized in our writing and publishing industry, which has been extraordinarily successful. And yet they get this tiny bit of money compared to the film industry. Film industry is doing nothing. The BC book industry is hugely responsible for the empowerment of First Nations in British Columbia, because you have to see the thousands of books that those publishers have been publishing since the 1970s. That's an incredible contribution that is never recognized. So our literary world is actually pretty amazing, but what's it doing now? I'm not sure. But going back to your original question, I think British Columbia is a special place because of geography and history, etc. And we have a remarkable opportunity to express that. And Greenpeace and Terry Fox, we have the ability to foment idealism. And that's really, really interesting to me.